They say the best way to disappear is to stand perfectly still. But I found a better way. I became the cleaning crew. For 3 years, I was a ghost in the gleaming offices of a tech company I helped build, wiping down the very conference table where my ex-husband, Maxwell, now held court. He talked about innovation and progress, completely oblivious to the fact that his greatest creation was built on my invisible labor, my uniform. Once a symbol of hard work, became a disguise, a way to hide from the man who told me I no longer belonged. This is the story of how a ghost became the only one who could save everything. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Clara Finch, and for 3 long years, I had perfected the art of disappearing. My life had become a quiet, methodical dance, the rhythm set by the polished marble floors and the hum of my cleaning cart. In the colossal glass and steel fortress that housed Archer Tech, a company I had once helped build, I was a ghost. My presence was an absence, and my greatest skill was being utterly, completely forgotten. My dark skin, a constant reminder of my difference in this sterile, monochrome world, only made the invisibility easier. My love for machines wasn't something I learned in a textbook. It was a legacy passed down to me through the worn, calloused hands of my grandfather, Arthur. He was a humble mechanic, a man who believed that every machine had a soul and a story to tell. His garage, smelling of oil, metal, and old wood, was my sanctuary, a place where the world's chaos melted away. He taught me to talk to engines, to listen to their rumbles and groans, to understand their ailments as if they were people. "Never rush a patient engine, little Finch," he would say, his eyes twinkling. "She'll tell you what's wrong when she's ready. All you have to do is listen." He taught me that true work was not about speed, but about patience, about seeing the history in a rusted bolt and the potential in a broken part. The last thing he ever gave me was a battered old wrench, its handle smooth and worn from a lifetime of use. "This tool," he told me, "is not for fixing. It is for listening." When I met Maxwell Archer in college, he was all ambition and fire, a brilliant mind with 1,000 ideas and a singular drive to succeed. He saw my hands not as stained or rough, but as an extension of my genius. He'd bring me his half-baked prototypes, and I would make them tangible, functional. Our partnership was a perfect balance, his vision, my craftsmanship. We built Archer Tech in my grandfather's old garage, late into the night, fueled by cheap coffee and the pure, unadulterated joy of creation. He'd sit on an old oil drum, sketching out business models on a greasy notepad, and I'd be under the hood, my hair tied back, a smudge of grease on my brown cheek. He'd always point to my hands and say, "These hands, Clara, are the real intellectual property of this company." But as the company grew, our world shrank. The endless hours in the garage were replaced by board meetings and investor dinners. Maxwell became obsessed with appearances, with the image of success. He started to see my passion as a liability, the oil on my hands a stain on his perfectly curated life. I remember one painful evening, before a charity gala, he handed me a pair of elegant white silk gloves. "Please, Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm, "just for tonight. They'll complete the look." It was a small request, but it was a quiet, suffocating demand for me to hide a part of myself. I wore them, and for the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. The final blow came 3 years ago, a week after we secured a billion-dollar funding round. He took me to the new penthouse, a cold, minimalist space filled with art I didn't understand. "Clara," he said, his voice flat, "this is our new life. It's clean, it's elevated. You and I are on different paths now. Your passion for old machines is, well, it's not a part of this world anymore. I'll make sure you're taken care of. But you can't be here. This life, it's not for you." He handed me a check, a clinical transaction for a love that had once felt infinite. My heart didn't just break, it shattered into a million tiny mechanical pieces. And so, I disappeared. I took the job as a cleaner at his company, a final, secret act of rebellion. I wanted to see the life he had built, to walk its halls as an invisible woman, and to know that I had escaped its hollow grandeur. I had found a strange kind of peace in my anonymity, returning to the world of machines in my small garage, the world Maxwell had told me to go back to. That morning in the main conference room, the air was thick with the scent of his success. I moved silently, a non-entity. Robert, a senior board member and a kind man who had worked with us since the beginning, looked right past me as I collected his cup. He was deep in a conversation with Julian, a ruthless, cynical investor who had joined the company after I left. He's got no soft spots. Julian, Robert was saying. Maxwell is all business. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I had once been his soft spot, and he had excised me for the sake of his career. Just as I was about to leave, the lights flickered, the grand video wall, a beacon of modern tech, went black. A moment of stunned silence was followed by a video that began to play automatically. On the screen was my grandmother, Genevieve Sterling. Her face, a roadmap of a life well lived, held a knowing smile that made my heart ache. My grandmother had passed away 6 months ago, but her legacy, a global empire built on her own terms, was as strong as ever. The board members, who I knew were already anxious about the power shift following my grandmother's death, sat up straighter. A lawyer's voice, calm and detached, began to read her final will. The terms were staggering a fortune of unprecedented size, and the controlling interest in Archer Tech a full 51% of the company. The faces of the board members went from shock to greed, then to a profound, sickening horror as the lawyer continued. This inheritance is to be shared between Maxwell Archer and Clara Finch. Under one specific condition, they must work together to rebuild a single engine in Mrs. Sterling's private garage. Only by completing this task together will they inherit the full estate. The room erupted in whispers. I stood frozen, my cleaning cart a shield. Maxwell's face, once so composed, was a mask of disbelief and rage. His eyes, frantic, darted across the room. He was looking for me, not with recognition, but with the dawning horror that his meticulously planned future now rested in my unseen hands. He saw me then, standing by the door. His eyes went wide, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. He didn't just see a cleaner. He saw the woman he had cast aside. He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. "This is a joke. This is all a joke." "Right, Clara," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. He took a step toward me, his hands on his hips, his designer suit a mockery of his anger. "Fine. You want to play games? I'll play. You, a mechanic, and me, a CEO? You fix that engine and I'll marry you." The boardroom went silent, the audacity of his public insult hanging in the air. "There," he said, the words dripping with scorn. "The terms are set. Now let's see what your passion for old machines is really worth." An hour later, I was in my grandmother's garage, a place I had not set foot in since her funeral. The air was a comforting blend of wood, oil, and dust, a stark contrast to the sterile environment I had just left. The engine sat on a hydraulic lift, a magnificent relic of a bygone era. Maxwell stood a few feet away, his designer suit looking absurdly out of place. He was on his phone, furiously typing. "This is a joke, right, Clara?" he said, without looking at me. "She can't be serious. We'll hire a team of the best engineers. We'll be done in a week." I just shook my head. The will said we have to do it. Maxwell, not a team, not a corporation, just you and me. And you added a new condition. Remember, my hands. And your promise. I walked over to the workbench, filled with my grandfather's old tools. A pang of bittersweet nostalgia hitting me. I picked up his last gift to me, the old wrench, its handle smooth and worn. We have to start from the beginning, I said softly. He scoffed. From the beginning, I'm a CEO. I don't get my hands dirty. I'll just find the schematics online. He showed me his phone, the screen filled with countless search results that led nowhere. See, this is a fool's errand. There's no data on this thing. There is no data, I agreed, because this engine isn't a product, it's a story. I took his hand, his soft, clean hand so different from my own. I placed the wrench in his palm. Try to listen. The engine will tell you what's wrong. His frustration was palpable. Over the next few weeks, I watched him struggle. He was a man of the abstract, and this was brutally, painfully real. His fingers, accustomed to typing, fumbled with the nuts and bolts. I watched him get his first cut, a small gash on his thumb from a slipped wrench. He looked at it with a mixture of shock and disgust, but he kept going. He had no choice, slowly, grudgingly. He started to learn. I didn't offer praise, only guidance. I taught him to feel for the subtle resistance, to hear the different sounds a healthy part makes versus a broken one. We worked in silence, a strange, unspoken truce. One afternoon, I was struggling to find a specific part. I went to a dusty old cabinet and found a small leather-bound book. It was my grandmother's journal. I opened it and found a section dedicated to the engine. There, on a fragile, yellowed page, was a beautiful hand-drawn schematic. But it wasn't just a technical drawing, it was a narrative. Next to each part, she had written a small note. I looked at one drawing and saw a note that read, "Camshaft from the Ford pickup your grandfather drove on our first date." Another note read, "Pistons from the classic sedan from our honeymoon." Tears welled up in my eyes. This wasn't just an engine. It was a museum of their love story. I showed the journal to Maxwell. He looked at the sketches, then at the notes. His carefully constructed wall of arrogance began to crumble. He saw the story in the machine. And in that moment, he saw me. He didn't just see the cleaner or the ex-wife. He saw the woman who had helped him build his dreams, the woman whose hands held the secrets to his own family's history. He finally understood. From that day on, our work was different. It was no longer a battle, it was a collaboration. He didn't question me, he learned from me. We worked side by side, our hands getting dirty together, our shoulders occasionally brushing against each other in the confined space. In those moments, I felt a connection, a small spark of what we once had. We were no longer Clara and Maxwell, the CEO and the cleaner. We were just two people working together to honor a beautiful story. Finally, the engine was complete. We stood back, our faces smudged with grease, our hands marked with the day's work. I turned the key, and with a deep, guttural roar, the engine roared to life. The sound filled the garage, a triumphant song, a declaration of a life found and a love rediscovered. Maxwell's eyes, now open and clear, were filled with a profound mixture of awe and regret. He looked at me, and I saw the true man, the one I had loved, behind the facade of the CEO. He turned to me, his voice choked with emotion. "Clara," he said, reaching for my hands. "I was so wrong. I was a fool. I had everything, but I lost the most important thing of all. I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. The company, the inheritance, it's all meaningless without you. Come back to me. Come back to our company. We can fix this. We can have a family. We can do this together. For real this time." But I just shook my head. The victory wasn't for him to claim, and it wasn't about the money. "Maxwell, this engine taught you a lesson, and it reminded me of one. I learned that a machine isn't just a collection of parts. It's a story. And my story with you is over. I don't need your world. I found a world of my own, one built on authenticity, on my own two hands. I will never belong there again." I left him standing in the garage, a modern man with an ancient engine, holding a legacy he couldn't grasp. The air outside was cool and clean on my grease-stained skin. Every step on the gravel path leading away from my grandmother's estate felt deliberate, a separation from a past that had imprisoned us both in different ways. I did not look back. I couldn't. I arrived at my own garage, my sanctuary, and stood for a long time among my familiar tools. I looked at my hands. They were caked with the oil and grime of my grandmother's engine. But underneath were my own calluses, earned by my own labor. I turned on the tap and began to wash them, but I stopped halfway through. I left a faint, greasy smear across my knuckles, a reminder, a mark. I was no longer a ghost defined by absence, nor a relic defined by someone else's past. I was the sum of what I had built. The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up to my garage. The man who stepped out was not Maxwell, but my grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Weatherby, a man who seemed to be woven from tweed and parchment. Miss Finch, he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. The task is done. The engine runs. The terms of the will have been met. There are papers to sign. We met in his downtown office, a world of mahogany, leather-bound books, and stately silence. Maxwell was already there. He looked different. The suit was still perfect, but there was a weariness in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not the exhaustion of an overworked CEO, but of a man who had fought an internal war and was only just beginning to understand the cost. He nodded at me, a quiet gesture of respect. Mr. Weatherby placed a thick stack of documents on the polished table between us. As stipulated, he began, the estate of Genevieve Sterling, including the 51% controlling interest in Archer Tech, is to be divided equally between you. This means you will each receive 25.5% of the company's shares, along with the liquid assets and properties listed in Appendix B. All that is required are your signatures. I stared at the pages. The numbers danced before my eyes, meaningless figures in a world measured by thousandths of an inch and the torque of a bolt. This was it. The golden cage, forged in legalese and gilded with unimaginable sums. Before I could speak, Maxwell's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and a frown creased his brow. "Excuse me," he said to Mr. Weatherby. "I have to take this." He put the call on speaker. Julian's voice, sharp as broken glass, filled the room. "Maxwell Robert just told me this ridiculous rumor is true. You spent the last month playing mechanic with her. The board is in an uproar. Our investors are questioning your leadership. You are turning this company into a laughingstock." Maxwell took a deep breath. The Maxwell of 3 months ago would have placated Julian with promises of profits and aggressive strategies. But the man sitting across from me was different. "Julian," Maxwell said, his voice level and firm, "I've spent the last month relearning the value of tangible things. We built a company on ideas, on algorithms and projections. We've forgotten that the foundation of all of that, every technological innovation started with someone. Somewhere. Getting their hands dirty. We lost touch with that. I lost touch with that." "What is this speech?" Julian scoffed. "Listen, Maxwell, I don't care about your garage philosophy. I care about quarterly returns. End this charade. Take control of your shares and cut her out of the equation. We need stability, not this sentimental family drama." "Clara is not an equation to be solved," Maxwell replied, his voice turning to ice. "She is the reason this company exists. And if the board can't see the value in that legacy, in that foundation, then maybe they're at the wrong company." He ended the call, leaving a stunned silence in the room. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not regret for what he'd just done, but confirmation. He finally understood what mattered. "Mr. Weatherby cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "If we could proceed." "Yes," I said, my voice clear in the quiet. "We can." I pushed my stack of papers back toward him. "I won't be signing these." "Both Maxwell and Mr." Weatherby looked at me, stunned. "Clara," Maxwell began, "you deserve it. You earned it." "I know," I said, "but I don't want it. Not like this." I turned to Mr. Weatherby. "Is there a way for me to restructure my portion of the inheritance?" The old lawyer blinked, clearly taken off guard. "Well, yes, you are the legal owner. You may do as you wish with it, liquidate, donate, create a trust." "A foundation," I said, the idea forming in my mind, clear and certain. I want to create a foundation, the Finch and Sterling Foundation. I glanced at Maxwell. For both my grandparents. Her vision and his craftsmanship. I went on, feeling a surge of power. I don't want the money. I want the power it represents. My 25.5% of Archer Tech will not be sold. It will be vested in this foundation. The dividends and profits from those shares will be used to fund vocational schools, apprenticeship programs, and grants for artisans, mechanics, and independent inventors, people with brilliant hands who lack resources, people like my grandfather, people like I used to be. I looked directly at Maxwell. Archer Tech will benefit. Your company will be funding the next generation of real-world innovators. It will reconnect the corporation to its roots. That is the legacy she wanted. Not a battle for control, but a balance, vision and craftsmanship, working together again. Maxwell stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time in years, I saw a genuine, unforced smile spread across his face. That's the most brilliant thing I've ever heard, he said softly. Then he turned to Mr. Weatherby. Draft it up. And my shares. I want 1% of my holdings vested in the foundation every year. Archer Tech needs to have skin in the game. We signed new papers that day, not a division, but a creation. 6 months later, I stood in a large, bright workshop, filled with natural light and the sound of metal on metal. The sign outside read, "The Finch and Sterling Center for Applied Innovation." It wasn't dark and greasy like my grandfather's garage. It was clean and modern. But it had the same soul. A group of young men and women were gathered around a complex hybrid engine, and I was showing them how to diagnose a microcontroller fault, not with a scanner, but by listening to the subtle change in the inverter's hum. I no longer wore the gray uniform of an invisible person. I wore grease-stained coveralls, and I had never felt more like myself. I was no longer a ghost in someone else's empire. I was the architect of my own world. Occasionally, Maxwell would stop by. He didn't wear expensive suits on these visits. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, and he never hesitated to get his hands dirty, asking the students about their projects, his eyes alight with genuine curiosity. He was changing Archer Tech from the inside, instituting an in-house garage division where engineers were free to experiment and build physical prototypes. He had learned that an idea is only truly powerful when you can hold it in your hands. One afternoon, he found me working on a vintage motorcycle. He said nothing, just handed me the wrench I was reaching for. We worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "She would be proud of you," he finally said. "She would be proud of us," I corrected, tightening a bolt. "We finally listened." He nodded, a small smile on his lips. He left me to my work, a man who had found his way, leaving me to mine. The inheritance wasn't in the money or the control. It was in the story we had chosen to build from the broken pieces, a story not of a love lost, but of two people who found the best versions of themselves, not in spite of each other, but because of the journey they were forced to share. And that, I realized, was the finest kind of well-built machine of all.